Hey everyone, Ryan here at Plague Scythe Studios. Welcome back to Pedalhead. Today's pedal of interest is the Moore Ocean Machine, Devin Townsend's signature delay, reverb, delay, looper, ambient box of magic all in one. And this is a pedal that I absolutely adore, but it actually hasn't seen much screen time on my videos. I did make a demo and review of this a little over a year ago at this point, I think, and it has shown up on a cover or two, but this is one of those things where generally I'm looking at high gain amplifier sounds or doing stuff in VST plugins, and this just doesn't see a lot of light of day, but I use it all the time, and it is one of my favorite pedals I own, period, in my collection. So, as is always the main goal with this series, we will be performing some comparative analysis between the individual models on this pedal with other popular delay and reverb pedals on the market, as well as my favorite amp modeler. And then there'll be a couple instances of just showing what this thing can do, because it's kind of its own unique beast, where in one instance, you might be able to kind of cop the same sort of sounds, just not nearly as efficiently with other gear. And in another instance, it would be practically impossible to use it in the same way, and I'll kind of walk you through that. If you want a deep dive of this pedal's functionality and hear some more of those out there sounds we may not cover here, feel free to watch that older demo. But as a quick wrap up, as I said, this is basically two delays and a reverb and a looper pedal all in one. And though it may look like it's, a delay into a delay into a reverb statically, you can actually move them around in so far as you can even make them parallel if you'd like. Generally, I run the blocks delay B into reverb into delay A, like Devin would. You can change whether the delays are ping pong or not. Generally, I keep the first one, delay B, not, and then delay A, have it kind of a stereo ping pong. Gets a cool, kind of mono into stereo reverb into stereo delay. That's my favorite sounds out of this. You have all sorts of ways that you can tweak these different sounds, most of which are up here. So you have mix, tone, time, and feedback on the delays, and you have mix, tone, and decay for the reverb. You also have this great shimmer control, which we won't be taking advantage of for the most part in this video for these straight comparisons, because nothing else really has this. But as I show what this pedal is really capable of, this is a great thing to bring in, because on a lot of reverb pedals, unless you're talking, Strymons or other pedals that may cost more than this entire unit, it's unlikely you'll have a shimmer control. And even stuff like the Axe-Fx AX8, you have to do some faking to get that sound. Each delay and reverb block has 9 separate models, with some of them crossing over between delay B and delay A. So say if you want to double stack analog models, you can do that, but there's some really funky ones here as well as with the reverb. So with stuff like the distortion reverb and say the modulation delay, it will give you more on-screen controls where you can scroll over, click on it, and then you can change stuff like the modulation depth or the frequency, all that kind of stuff that may not be up here, but you still, for the most part, have all the tweakable parameters at your fingertips. And between that and the display, having stuff like, clicking these two to get to the looper, clicking these two to get to tap tempo, I really don't feel the need to, plug into any software to tweak this thing, whereas I would with a lot of other complex modelers. And in that way, I kind of feel like this is its own instrument, and it's really well thought out. There's these little, you got nice little touches like the 2 inputs, the 2 outputs. You can see the arrows, all the foot switches light up in terms of the tempo. Just a lot of great stuff. MIDI controllable, although I do hear that could be a bit of a pain. And you have an expression pedal control for any of the variables. You can assign all that stuff in the settings. So it's a really compact, smartly designed pedal. The question is, how does it sound compared to the competition? To kick this off, let's start with some reverb shootouts. We'll of course have the Ocean Machine set to reverb only, all other blocks disabled. And for the remainder of this video, this will be on the play setting, meaning I'm not using presets. That way you'll be able to see exactly what's on screen, exactly what the controls are. For our pedal equivalent, or single stomp box, we have the Boss RV5. We'll be keeping the tone and time controls at noon, much like the tone and decay controls here at noon, no shimmer, but the mix will be 66%, or as close as I can get it with an analog control here. And then for our amp modeler, of course, we'll have the Fractal AX8 reverb block. Again, there will be some tweaks to individual reverb models to make them sound more similar to this, or really how I want them to sound, but you'll be able to see all those parameters that were changed when we get to that. And finally, all of the amplifier sounds for each test will be coming from the Mesa Boogie Mark IV. I'm not really going to show the settings. It doesn't matter. They're the same each time, but we'll be going through all 3 channels at some point, going through the same impulse response. That way there's no other variables between each test. I think the first thing apparent in that comparison is even though the effect level is set visually identically to the Ocean Machine, this was much quieter in the mix, and that gets into the whole problem with comparing apples and oranges at the same setting, because there's no such thing as perfectly same settings when we're talking about, you know, potential differences in the pod, or maybe maxed out here is actually only 80%, whereas this is truly 100%, but it was still enough to hear there was a big difference in stereo imaging where this came last place for sure. The AX8 still had kind of a bigger swell in both left and right channels. This had almost a modulation going on all of them, especially the mod reverb, but that was intentional. But the room, the spring, all of them had some wobble to it, which I didn't expect. It's something I never really noticed until comparing it directly. And it sounds good, but it certainly has its own character. This is by far the driest of the bunch. And if I were playing standard classic rock, blues, country, I would have no problem with this. But to my ears, the Fractal firmware exhibited this high quality enveloping reverb that I absolutely love, but it's a little more boilerplate, a little drier compared to this, which is fine. I think that's what Fractal excels at, is kind of providing a blank slate for all of their effects, and you can always tweak them as you go, but I'm happy with the sound as is. This, not bad whatsoever, but there is certainly an element of being lower quality comparatively. Now in a vacuum, I'm always happy to play through this, but for anything that's halfway progressive, anything that you want a big sound with, I would definitely choose the Ocean Machine over this pedal. But of course, just for one reverb, it's a little overkill. So that brings us to delays. For the Boss Camp, I'll be swapping out the RV5 for the DD7. This is one of the more popular delays on the market. In this price range, it has multiple digital models, as you might expect. There's the 200 millisecond, which we'll be using for the digital equivalent there. We'll also be using analog and modulate. We won't be looking at reverse today, but we will have this on the tape setting at one point, as well as the AX8, which this does not have. And the point of that is to see, if we take the next closest setting here, does it matter to you? Is these few disadvantages and greater capability of this device worth it? And if so, then you can decide on your own. It sounds like the tides have turned a bit when it comes to the delay test, and I thought I royally screwed something up with the AX8 there, and I think my tap tempo might have been off just a tad, but looking at the numbers, the actual milliseconds, and still had the quarter note trip setting, it sounded way more different than I would have expected it to. For my money, Ocean Machine won that one hands down, but with the caveat in that all the delay models we heard, kind of these more traditional, not out there ones, sounded not all that different. But as you turn up the tone, which we didn't do in these tests, I have heard, the digital has more high frequency content as you'd expect. The analog kind of has that high pass thing going on, and low pass thing, and the tape definitely sits more in the middle. But it's still kind of all the same feel, which is good because that's what I like out of it. And what I really like about the digital models here is they're kind of already washed out a bit, which some people may not want, and I totally respect that. But for me, I really like a delay that is soft, that you don't have to throw a reverb afterwards, and I think this does a good job of that too. Again, the difference between the analog and digital models weren't night and day, and even the modulation didn't have all that much modulation on it. It's a very subtle chorus effect, where this, you can really dial it up if you want, and at the settings that I liked it was kind of on the verge of too much for me. But you got options here. Either way, I love the sound of this pedal. You just don't have as many tweakable parameters as you would here. For the AX8, it's another example of it being a blank slate. I love the delay and reverb, and especially the multi-delay blocks on that floorboard. The problem is I always have to tweak them to my liking, whether it be adding some modulation over it, or changing the EQ a bit, or throwing a low in the mix reverb after a delay to kind of wash it out, which is what I like. Again, maybe that's not what you want, but for the just in the box sound, throw something on and it sounds right. I definitely think the Ocean Machine came out ahead, but it also highlights the strength of the DD7 that I really like, in that it's just kind of mix ready. You throw it in a loop or put it in the post effects and it sounds great. There's really nothing else you need if you are looking for a good delay sound. Just expect to tweak the AX8 unless you've downloaded a preset and it's done for you, which don't worry, I do that most of the time for you. Now, even if you've preferred the sound of the Ocean Machine on all the tests so far, it's kind of a hard sell for a single effect at a time unit. And I think that will show its strength in this upcoming test, where we'll take a stereo delay and run it through a stereo reverb, focusing on more of the traditional sounds right now. And what you'll probably find is I have anecdotally is the differences between stuff like an analog or tape model running into, say, a hall or room model. They all kind of come out in the wash because it's a non-linear, very ocean wavy sounding sound that I like. Of course, we'll be using the standard delay and reverb blocks on the AX8 and see how this sounds. Now we're starting to cook. And one of the interesting things you might have noticed on the settings for each of these devices is both on the AX8 and the Ocean Machine, I kept the overall mixed at 50% for both delay and reverb, same with the AX8. However, with the Boss pedals, I kept the effect levels at 66% each, yet these were still the quietest. In fact, when I just copy pasted, the 50% effect level, I could barely hear these things. And I guess it goes to show just how important it is to design these models to play well with one another. And for me, they definitely nailed it with the Ocean Machine. I find that no matter where you set these feedback or mix parameters, you can always hear the guitar, unless you're at like 100% and it becomes super washed out. But even, this is way further than I would ever normally set it on the AX8, and you can hear why. The delays are still super defined to the point that I usually never go past about 25% if I'm going for this kind of washed out rhythm sound. Whereas this, you can just keep cranking it and it sounds glorious. These tests really highlight some of the cool tricks with this pedal where the delay trails are still articulate. You can hear them as full-fledged delays, but they react with the reverbs kind of on that tail end where it just kind of disintegrates into musical, it's noise, but it's musical noise. And you don't get that with these especially. They just kind of wash out together. And again, if you play with the feedback and the time and the tone, you could get it closer to this. But at the noon settings, at settings that I think a lot of guitar players are just going to set and walk away from because it's scary to deviate for some people, it just doesn't do it. It does not do the whole ambient big sound thing. And so for that, I definitely would mark these off the list as serious contenders. For the AX8, again, more tweaking, it does a great job. I've used it all the time for these kind of sounds. I've recorded with it, with those kind of sounds. But in terms of just being, turn it on and done, it doesn't happen. And I think that slight chorus wobble we're hearing on the reverb models, and especially that kind of soft, washed out delay effect, they really play well together. It just sounds like Ocean Machine. Like it legitimately, when you plug in, especially like the plate model, some of these more classic delays, it's perfect. I love that sound. For our final comparison, let's hear what the Ocean Machine can really do in the way that I play with it 90% of the time. That is running a delay into a stereo reverb into a stereo delay again. And to equate that with pedals, we'll be adding this Mooer Baby Water, which is perhaps the worst name for a pedal ever. We'll have it set to the regular echo setting with level, time, and feedback all set to noon. So this is just like a straight stereo or straight mono digital delay at that point, running into the RV5 and then finally running into the DD7. And I think what you'll see here again is that as you stack these effects on top of each other, even though we're using, say, the tape model here on the AX8, those differences really start to become harder to pick out as you add more effects. And it's something you might be able to hide with even something like this cheap $60-ish chorus and delay pedal. So let's hear it. This is definitely the closest that our pedal setup has gotten to the Ocean Machine. It's crazy how something as simple as moving your signal chain and adding a little cheap echo beforehand can really add to the depth and the richness of the echo sound. Still, for me, the Ocean Machine wins in terms of just set it, walk away, and it sounds great, and it has that baked in ambient reverb noise going on. The AX8, again, could get there, but as is in its default setup, if you don't want to have to scroll through multiple pages to tweak it, it just doesn't work that way out of the box for that sound. Of course, if you've seen any of my past AX8 videos, you'll know that just throw on a chorus block, maybe change the delay for a multi-delay, tweak the reverb a bit, and you can achieve those kind of rich outer space-like sounds. But there's still something to be said for a product. You can just walk up and go, yeah, there, turn the mix down, tone, done. And that's what this does super well. In short, none of these comparisons were exhaustive benchmarks in any way for any of the products featured. This is simply the most consistent and least time-consuming, although it was still very time-consuming, way to compare them all. And really, to get the best out of any of the products, you'll have to tweak. You'll have to experiment, and that's part of the fun for me. But they all have kind of a different use case. They all have a different flavor. None of the room reverbs sound exactly alike. For me, the Boss is just your straight up vanilla reverb sound. It's fine. It's really good at that. The AX8 is a blank slate that wants you to tweak, that wants you to say, well, maybe we can dial back the echo intensity and turn up the time, and I'd like to tweak the EQ here, maybe add some slight modulation to it, and that's when it sounds its best, is when you deviate from the norm. This has its own sound, and I really like that sound. But if you're not looking for, that kind of wavy reverb or washed out delay, or you don't particularly like the way they all interact together, then this doesn't have much value for you. But to me, this has enough of a difference between all the other products that I have, and it works in a way that's really enjoyable to use. It's a no-brainer to own for me. Now let's take a look at some of the things that this can do that, well, you'd be spending a little bit more money on your other setups to match it with. So we'll be listening to some of the more out there sounds like the distortion reverb, the Galaxy crystal delays. Although with some of this doesn't necessarily fit the music, but you can hear kind of what they all do. All of these weird tones that you've heard, whether it be the fuzzy or low bit delay models or some of the stranger reverb things are, they're sounds that you could achieve with practically any modern amp modeler, but you would absolutely be using a lot more blocks than just a delay or a reverb. You'd have to throw in some sort of distortion sound, run something in parallel, and for that reason, I really like just having these preset models where you could just flip to it, make a couple adjustments, and you're done. And ultimately, as we've shown, even if you set it the same, it's not going to sound the same. You'll have to tweak it by ear. And if that were it, if everything we've talked about were all the tricks up the sleeve of this pedal, I'd still love it. But there's one more that I never even use to its full potential, but I could sit and just dick around with it for days on end because it is so cool. So what this really has over especially stomp boxes, but even amp modelers, is the ability to tweak in real time and make music with it in ways that you simply can't with any of the other gear that I own. For instance, if you run a looper block and say just make one note and say 2-second passage, fill in, fill out, whatever, you can actually in real time bring in reverb. You can adjust the delay, the tone, the time, get your little record scratching squeal sounds. You can change the delay models. The trails of the old delays will still interact with the new ones. And depending on how you have some of these different settings involved, you can get some otherworldly synth-like tones. And all that's simply using a traditional guitar setup. There's nothing stopping you from taking anything, using a 1/4-inch line out and interfacing with this keyboard, synths, hell, a microphone output of some kind. You can do something with it and make ambient noises that I can't even describe, but they are so cool. And in that way, that's why I view this as kind of its own instrument. The way I play with it 95% of the time does not even scratch the surface of what this can do. And with amp modelers, with most pedals, you're not going to get that functionality. In stuff like the AX8, you can change some delay parameters if you assign it to a foot switch, and if you have the trails and the patches set up just right, then you can make different, models interact with each other. But I feel for those, that's a capture a sound and then switch to another sound or deactivate a couple blocks at a time. That's what it's good at. It's not good at, tweaking and making music with it like that. And that's not something I want to do with those anyway, but this just gives it that much more value for those that like to make ambient stuff. To wrap this thing up, if you had any doubts about this pedal, or you thought, oh, it's just a rehash of Dad's old delay and reverb pedal collection, I hope you doubt no more, because this is a serious piece of machinery and is a serious contender for any professional pedal board. In fact, it's probably one of the only signature products that I really am in love with. This is something that was scrutinized by its creators, whose every corner, every piece of I/O was really put there for a reason, not just because, well, everyone else does it, or this is industry standard, so we have to do it this way. This is really well thought out, to the point I'd never even cracked the manual for months because I had it figured out. And then once I did, it was like, oh, I can do that with it. That's really cool. For me, this is what I want an ambient, funny sound pedal to do. It does everything I want it to. Not to say you can't do great stuff with Eventide or Strymon or all these other, higher end stuff, but for $300, this is nuts. I've seen it as low as like $230 used or B stock. I mean, you can barely buy 2 Boss pedals in terms of the higher end delay and reverb pedals for, $300. And then you get 2 delays, reverb, looper, all this functionality. And again, if you want that kind of plain Jane dry sound, then that is probably going to be fine for you. But if you like the character of this, I mean, it knocks it out of the park. What else can I say? So for me, this is a 10 out of 10 pedal. I will never get rid of this, and this will be my go-to for anything halfway progressive or ambient sounding. So hope you enjoyed that episode of Pedalhead. I just want to smack my keyboard. If you have any questions, comments, as always, please leave them down below. Any suggestions, I'll also hear them, and we will see you next time. Bye.